Rick Wiles.
This is True News, 1 hour of uncensored news, views, and commentary. Welcome to the program. I'm Rick Wiles. Today is Friday, April 27, 2012. Climatologist Cliff Harris will be here later to discuss extreme weather patterns, chemtrails, and geoengineering, earthquake detonators, and a lot of other topics you won't hear today on the false news channels. That's why our name is True News. You've probably noticed that in recent years, I have primarily focused on the twin topics of global economic collapse and world war. I want to devote my time in this first segment to discussing recent developments in Iran. First, U.S. experts told a congressional hearing in Washington yesterday that Iran is acquiring the technical know-how to launch a devastating cyber attack on U.S. infrastructure, including the electricity grid. Number two, Israel Defense Force Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Benny Gantz said on Thursday that other countries have prepared their armed forces to attack Iran. He did not name the other countries. He hinted that Israel has the support of those nations to go to war with Iran. General Gantz said the military force is ready, not only our forces, but other forces as well, end of quote. Depka.com, an intelligence newsletter with deep ties to the Israeli Mossad, released some new information last night indicating the countdown to war may be only weeks away. I'll remind you again that the Russians are anticipating an Israeli attack on Iran this summer. Debka reported that Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Ehud Barak both left Washington in recent weeks deeply disappointed over the lack of support from the Obama White House. Debka said Israeli officials were stunned recently when informed that Iranian scientists have mastered the manufacture of a nuclear bomb trigger. With the materials and technology already on hand, Iran could build a nuclear warhead within 43 days. That means Israel must act very soon, certainly much sooner than the date Barack Obama pressured Mr. Netanyahu to accept, sometime after the November election. Besides, Mr. Netanyahu doesn't trust Barack Obama to keep his word. Debka also reported that Israeli officials are considering the possibility that Iran has already developed nuclear radiological dirty bombs that could be supplied to Islamic terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. Debka reports that Israeli war planners are anticipating the possibility of a surprise Iranian nuclear attack on Israel. One Israeli scenario has a civilian plane or ship carrying a large nuclear device leaving Lebanon with Athens or Cyprus registered with flight planners as its designation. Instead, the aircraft would veer southwest and fly within minutes to Israel's most northwestern point on the Lebanese border. Iranian suicide airmen and frogmen would detonate the bomb 50 to 60 kilometers off the Israeli Mediterranean coast on contact with the water's surface. Now, that scenario means that Iran would attempt to explode a nuclear weapon at sea to create a tidal wave that would wipe out Tel Aviv and coastal regions. The tsunami wave could potentially kill up to 3 million Jews. Debka said Israeli war planners say Iran could strike Israel within weeks, but most likely the war will happen sometime between September and November 2012. Now, there's a real possibility. I've been stressing this for months. There is a real possibility that this Middle East war will happen this year. The Russians have been arming their military forces for 2 years in anticipation of this war. Furthermore, Russian news media outlets report that the Kremlin expects Israel to attack Iran this summer, possibly July or August. And as I mentioned, Israeli Lieutenant General Benny Gantz said other nations are ready to help Israel attack Iran. Now, he may be referring to the Sunni Muslim Arab nations such as Saudi Arabia that are scared also that the Shiite-controlled Iran will be armed with nuclear warheads. And we should consider the possibility that Iran will not wait to be attacked, as these scenarios described by Debka tell us. There is serious concern inside Israel that Iran may carry out a preemptive first strike on Israel. And it reminds me of the old Gunsmoke TV show. Marshal Matt Dillon never drew his gun first. He'd stand there and stare at the gunslinger and only pull out his Colt 45 out of his holster when he was certain the bad guy was going to shoot. That's what may happen this summer, as both Israel and Iran stare at each other, looking for a sign that the other side is ready to shoot first. It's all about split-second timing. Now, here's something to consider and pray about. Ramadan will start on Friday, July 20th this year. Interestingly, the Jewish month of Av starts on July 20th also. The 9th of Av is a historically somber day for the Jews. Many of the worst tragedies in their history happened on the 9th of Av. That's why it's called the saddest day in Jewish history. Now, the first calamity was when the 12 spies sent by Moses to scout out the land of Canaan came back, and 10 of them gave an evil report on the 9th of Av. That seems to have set in motion the rest of the story, because the Jews have been receiving an evil report on the 9th of Av ever since. Also, the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians on the 9th of Av in 586 BC. The second temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, as prophesied by Jesus. The Pope declared the first crusade on the 9th of Av in 1095. And Jews have been expelled, deported, and kicked out of a lot of the nations around the world throughout history on the 9th of Av. So there's really nothing for the Jews to celebrate on that day. It's a very dark day in Jewish history. So where am I going with this? Ramadan starts this year on July 20. The month of Av starts on July 20. The 9th of Av is July 29. Would the Israelis dare to attack Iran during Ramadan, the holiest Islamic holiday period? Or would the Iranians dare to attack Iran on the 9th of Av, July 29th? Will the Jews get revenge on the Muslims for the 1973 Yom Kippur War? After all, the Arabs attacked the Jews on one of their most sacred days. Now, I've always heard the 1973 war referred to as the Yom Kippur War. But what do the Muslims call it? They call it the Ramadan War. That's right. The 1973 Yom Kippur War was also held during Ramadan. And there's one more thing to consider about July 20, 2012. It's exactly 3.5 years since Barack Hussein Obama became president and started to utter blasphemies against Almighty God, His holy church, and to make war against the saints of God. We're 3.5 years into his reign of terror, starting on July 20th. Now let's take a break, and when I come back, climatologist Cliff Harris will join me when I return. You're listening to True News, the End Time Newscast. Well, you are listening to True News, your Christian alternative source for global news, analysis, and commentary. I'm Rick Wiles. You don't have to be a scientist to recognize that something strange is happening to the weather around the world. Weird weather patterns and events are now the norm. Climatologist Cliff Harris is paying close attention to this unusual development. He's one of the top climate experts in America. Along with his business partner, meteorologist Randy Mann, Mr. Harris is co-founder of Harris Mann Climatology, a long-range weather forecasting firm. The company's website is longrangeweather.com. Cliff, welcome back to True News.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Well, Cliff, I was reading the article you have posted on your website, longrangeweather.com, that the world's weather system is experiencing the wildest weather extremes in at least 1,000 years. Is it really that extreme?
It is that extreme. We use the 1,000-year mark because at that time there were some extremely weird weather patterns reported by Leif Erikson, the Norse chieftain. He reported in his journals that the weather had become extremely weird. And that was because during this time period they were in a warm period, and of course later on the Vikings were frozen out by the Little Ice Age. But around the year 1000 it was very warm, and he was able to take his longships over to Newfoundland, and there's a lot of evidence there that he discovered America way before Christopher Columbus. But that time period was extremely weird worldwide, and we're back to that same cycle again at this present time, and we believe that we're peaking on the warm cycle and we'll soon be heading into a much colder period. Russian scientists are saying the same thing. Chinese scientists, the same thing. Climate scientists, Australians are saying the same thing, basically. So when you have two widely opposing patterns clashing heads directly, you're going to have some awfully weird weather. Now, I can tell you one thing that I think is about the weirdest thing I've seen in my 60-plus year career. I saw this past week, we saw the biggest snow ever for so late in the season along much of the East Coast, Virginia, Maryland, parts of Pennsylvania, New York State. And in some areas, it was the biggest snow of the entire winter season.
I mean, was it something like 22 inches in some areas?
Yeah, and that's the biggest of the entire winter season.
And Cliff, I grew up in Maryland. You know, I lived in Maryland until, my, late 30s, early 40s. And a snow in April was a rare event. And usually it was, a half inch, 1 inch,
right.
A little spring dusting. But 22 inches in April, that's unheard of.
Schools were closed. Businesses were closed. And it was the biggest storm for the first time ever. It was the biggest storm of the entire winter season at the end of April. There's nothing in recorded history going back 400 years in this country for something like that. That's how weird that was. Over in Hawaii, they had the biggest hailstorm ever to hit Oahu in March. About 3 weeks ago, San Francisco had its worst thunderstorm ever recorded. All four of the posts on the Bay Bridge, the highest areas there, were hit simultaneously by lightning bolts. I mean, very, very unusual weather. The tornadoes that we've had from the clashes of record warmth and record cold all coming together and creating misery for a lot of folks.
And a simplified explanation is because we're at the end of a warming cycle and it's clashing with the beginning of a cooling cycle. Is that
you hit it?
That's it?
I mean, you hit it right on the nose because that's exactly what's happening, Rick. And that's why widely opposing air masses don't readily mix. And that's why we're having such a big problem here.
Hey, I'll tell you something.
It's going to get worse, not better, believe me.
I'll tell you something that's weird. And I know this is out of your expertise because this involves geology. But I have been carefully following the number of sinkholes that are appearing, some massive sinkholes that are appearing. But in the past week, I have posted on TrueNews.com 2 very weird stories of humans falling in sinkholes as they walked. There was a teenager, I believe in China. You can see the video. I still have a link today to this video. Closed circuit TV caught it. She's walking down the street on the sidewalk. She's talking on the cell phone. The sidewalk caved in, and the teenager fell down inside the earth. And then yesterday, I don't recall. I think this one was in the United States. There was a man walking on a beach, and a sinkhole opened up, and he went down inside the sand. They had to dig the man out. This is weird, Cliff.
And they had another one where another young girl fell into a sinkhole, and she called from the sinkhole on her cell phone, and they came and pulled her out.
This is weird.
It is, but there are so many weird things happening. Just look at what happened in Eastern Europe, the stands, Uzbekistan, Turkestan, Kakistan, all the way down into Greece, Turkey, down into North Africa, some of the coldest weather ever recorded this winter, while we had, along the East Coast, the warmest winter on record and the warmest March on record. Well, this warmest March was followed by an April here that has had record snows and 6 to 7 freezes that have hurt the crops in many areas that were planted in March because people thought summer was arriving 3 months early. But that isn't the way it works, and they were frozen out, no insurance, and they can't find corn seed that's high yielding because of the fact they don't have any more left. So they're in a real bind.
All right, as we exit the warming cycle and enter the cooling cycle, how long does this turbulence last where the two cycles are clashing?
Usually about 30 years.
30 years?
Yeah.
What's the starting
date? It's usually about 30 years.
Well, what's the starting date of this thing?
We started, believe it or not, in 1968.
All right, so we're actually towards the end of the turbulence.
In 2008, in that time period, we should have been, long past this thing, but it's still going on, these clashes. But here's the thing that's very interesting, that we had another peak, a secondary peak on this warm in the late 90s. So some people say we have to start counting this next 30 years from the late 90s. So that would take us up to near 2020, something like that, maybe even 2030 before we get out of it.
Okay. So that second,
this cooling could happen at any time, though. Mm-hmm. It could just come over us, just almost within a few years. And I'm not so sure that it isn't already starting, because if you look at the winter in Eastern Europe, all the way south to North Africa, in many areas it was the coldest winter since the 1600s, since the Maunder minimum, and they had record snows, and the canals in some places froze in Venice and Italy. Rome had schools closed for 3 days because of snow, extremely rare. Snow in Sicily, snow in North Africa, as I mentioned, snow in Algeria, from there across into Libya, and even some snow in the Sahara Desert. And temperatures down to as low as 24 degrees in the Sahara Desert. Very, very unusual weather. At the same time, we had record highs. But that's what happens. On one side, the cold air comes down. On the back side, the warm air comes up. And then back of that, the cold air comes down. And we had the snowiest March in recorded history in the interior Northwest up into Alaska, where it was their snowiest winter on record in many places.
There are several prominent Russian climatologists who are, certain that this mini ice age is going to kick in 2013 or 14. Are you seeing it the same way?
Well, and one of my good friends is Robert Felix. You've heard of him, I'm sure. He has IceAgeNow.com.
Sure.
And he thinks that we're already going into the initial stages. I'm not quite so sure yet. I think it's still that period of extremes, and we're not out of it yet. But I do believe that this will take place, that we will go into a much colder cycle. There's even verses in the Bible that hint that there will be a mini ice age that will occur because the sun will be darkened and for some reason, and it's going to be quite cold.
You know, most people, you know, Cliff, most Christians that know those verses never equate that the darkening of the sun there's going to be a reaction on the planet. It's going to be really cold.
Yes, and it's going to go from really hot to really cold overnight because man is going to shake his fist at God because it's too hot and too dry, and then it's going to get too cold.
Okay,
and
what are the signs
of this period? It could happen right during the tribulation period, and we may be getting close to that.
Okay, as we approach this transition into the cooling cycle, and as you've said, it could be any day, but at the same time, we may be years into this intermediary phase between the extremes until it kicks over. What are the signs that you will be looking for to know that we've gone over into this cooling cycle? And don't tell me you'll be shivering because we know that part, you know.
Yeah.
But what are you going to be looking for to know that we've actually made that transition?
The first signs of this, sort of the signs that you would see up front, would be more freezes over several years much farther south than normal. In other words, you would have geckos falling out of the trees in Florida and crocodiles dying because of the cold and what have you. That's already happened. Tomatoes were in short supply because they were hurt in Florida and in Texas in the Rio Grande Valley and down into Mexico. In other words, you would have freezes during the winter much farther south than normal. You would have freezes into the spring season much later than normal, earlier in the fall season. These would be things that we'd be seeing. Snows out of season. More north-south pattern to the upper-level jet streams than the normal zonal flow from west to east. These are some of the things that you'd see. Rare events in Hawaii, California, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa.
Well, how much of this has already happened?
Well, it's all happened. I was just being a little facetious.
I know. This is what I'm sitting here saying, wait a minute, we're already in it.
Yeah, but this doesn't mean that we're going into a full-blown ice age. This just means that we may be heading into what would be called maybe another little ice age. But we're overdue for the great ice age, another great ice age. But I don't believe we're headed there yet. But here's the problem that we're facing. There's a lot of money in global warming, but not much in global cooling. The money's all on the Al Gore global warming side. And so what they're doing is they're trying to cool the planet by putting these chemtrails of aluminum on glass particles into the upper atmosphere, into the stratosphere, to bounce these rays back into space. They're doing that at the same time we're going from the peak of the warm to the colder, and they're exacerbating the pattern. Man is sticking his foot in playing God where he shouldn't be. And here's some of the things that have happened. We've seen the pollution of water around, especially Mount Shasta in Northern California. California has had the 3 coldest summers back to back to back in 2009, 10, and 11 on record. They've had much more high cloudiness, and a lot of that has been put there by these jets that put these chemtrails in the stratosphere. Then these particles precipitate down and pollute the waters. That's on our website, longrangeweather.com. It's up to 50,000 times the amount of aluminum considered safe.
Cliff, you know this is a subject that officially does not exist.
I realize that. It's an elephant hiding in the living room.
Yeah, you can tilt people's heads up to the clouds and show them the jets spraying it, and they go, I don't know what you're seeing. I've never seen such denial in my life. I've been aware of it since the late 90s.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know?
But it's going on more now than ever before. And you can see the grid patterns. We took pictures yesterday in southwestern Iowa of this grid pattern, back and forth and back and forth.
Sure.
And unlike normal jet contrails that disperse, these don't disperse. They spread out from horizon to horizon.
And they create a milky white film in the sky.
That's right. And that does bounce rays back into space. It plays havoc with GPS units. Some farmers can't use their GPS units anymore in their tractors because they have to go and mark off their acreage because it's not dependable.
Last month, NASA launched 5 rockets simultaneously from Virginia, and they released aluminum into the air. And they said that they called it a harmless tracer element, so that the scientists could monitor the jet stream, like they haven't known by now where the jet stream's going. You have any idea what they were doing with those 5 rockets releasing aluminum?
Well, I mean, that's just going along with what they've been already doing. And I have one fellow that told me he doesn't want to give his name out because he doesn't want to get into trouble. And we talked about that very thing, and he asked me if I would not go into that too much until he could get more information for me. But he says what they were doing is they were creating a mirror so they could spy on Iran and other countries, particularly Iran. And if they got it up high enough, it would reflect back, and they could spy on Iran from these particles that they're putting up there. It has a mirror effect.
Now that, I've speculated that they're experimenting with the ability to create like a movie screen in the sky.
That's what they were doing, and it has little to do with the jet streams because we know. Just ask the Weather Service. We know where those jet streams are. We can tell by the frontal boundaries. And we know what the winds are because they send balloons up to test them. This was way above the weather, okay? Way above the jet streams.
Cliff, what if
higher stratosphere, Rick?
Cliff, what if another, and again, I'm just speculating, what if another purpose is to create that artificial movie screen in the sky so that you could project images?
Well, absolutely. And not only receive them, but project them. Mm-hmm. And then there's other things that we're kind of concerned about. And on this drone technology, I had one fellow tell me that he worked on the drones years ago when they were first putting them together. And he said that one of the purposes that they were going to use those for was to poison water supplies, fresh water supplies, lakes, streams of our enemies, creating water that would be worth more, and I put this in my column this week, that a barrel of water fresh, clean water would be worth more than a barrel of oil. These are some wild things going on right now that we're seeing, and they're just doing things haphazardly, not telling us what they're doing. They're going over our heads literally, and that's why I put in there that those aren't just raindrops dropping on our heads.
You know, Cliff, I know you're a Christian, you love the Lord, and I'm of the belief that many of the things, many of the things that happen in the last days in the tribulation are not from God. They're man-made.
Yeah.
And this is why God intervenes, because the human race is ready to destroy itself and the planet. In fact, that's why he creates a new earth, because we messed it up so bad.
Well, in Zechariah, it talks about men standing and dying right where they're standing, with their flesh being consumed while they're standing into the holes where their eyes were. They'll be consumed where they're standing. And to me, this ties in with the nuclear aspects.
Well, it's interesting you brought that up, because just a few minutes before you and I started this conversation, I saw an article from Times of India. This is today. It says over 1 billion people across the world would face starvation if India and Pakistan unleashed nuclear weapons, even if that war is regionally limited. According to a new study released on Wednesday, that's because the deadly and polluting weapons would cause major worldwide climate disruptions that would dramatically drive down food production in China, the U.S., and other countries. The study, the author, Dr. Ira Helfand, of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, said the grim prospects of nuclear famine requires a fundamental change in our thinking about nuclear weapons. Goes on, talks about the study. But,
well, even if Israel goes after the nuclear weapons of Iran and they don't get them all, and Iran launches a nuclear weapon at Israel, which could happen, that could cause some very, very serious problems.
Well, what about what if they get them, just bombing Bushehr and the other? We're talking about bombing nuclear facilities.
Yeah, and it could have a chain reaction there. They wouldn't have to launch anything; it'd be launched on its own. We live in a scary world now. I'm sure glad that I put my faith in the Lord, because I don't put my faith in these yokels that are running everything.
They're psychopaths.
They're just doing it. Yeah, they're doing everything on their own. And I've had these people tell me, well, we're successful. We're cooling the planet. I said, you're just conducting dangerous experiments without our permission. And you know what they put on, you can get these tapes, by the way, what in the world are they spraying, and why are they spraying? There's 2 DVDs out, and you can get them on the Internet using those titles. And in the first one there, what in the world are they spraying? A fellow by the name of David Keith, they interviewed him from the University of Calgary, and he says, well, we don't deny that we're doing these things, but we have to cool the planet. It's runaway global warming. And we got to do something. The planet is being killed by this warming, which is a bunch of bunk. And they said, well, what about the fallout? What about the residual problems, the collateral damage? And he said, well, I guess you might say that we're free riding on the health and welfare of our grandkids. That's what's on tape.
Someday.
And people were just bewildered by that. How can they do these things? And it's like having the elephant in the room. And you can look up and you can see them crisscrossing, going back and forth. These aren't jet planes filled with passengers. They're putting chemicals up there, dangerous chemicals.
Cliff, are they doing it only in the USA, or is
no? They're doing it in Canada and the NATO nations.
So it's a NATO operation.
In Belgium, they tested a well in Belgium, and it had, I think, 40 or 50 times the dangerous barium in it than the water should have had.
Okay, so this is a NATO operation.
It's a NATO operation with the U.S. and Canada going along with it.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Obama, I guess, gave his permission to do these things.
Mm-hmm.
We have a treaty about this, but no one's living up to it, okay? They're supposed to inform us and all this. They're not doing anything. They're not informing anybody. They're doing this hiding. You might say they're hiding in plain sight, Rick.
Sure. That's the way they do a lot of this stuff. Cliff,
I'm tired of it myself.
Me too.
I think we need to stand up and be united and do something while we still have time left, because these yokels are going to kill us all ahead of time here. They're going to bring on the tribulation, in my opinion.
They are as crazy as the Nazis.
Oh, absolutely. And we're the peons. There's no other way to describe us. One guy didn't like that term, but that's what we are.
Cliff, I've been paying very close attention, but ever since last year, I've been watching Fukushima. Obviously, the news media around the world is they've done a major blackout. The governments aren't going to talk about it, but the reactors at Fukushima are still boiling.
And people are still there around them.
Oh yes.
They don't care. They don't care as long as they can get their Toyotas out.
Those people are dead. I mean, they're just walking dead. Hillary Clinton signed a treaty recently with Japan so that the U.S. would import Japanese food products. the radiation, the debris is starting to wash up on the shores of the United States and Canada. The water is still leaking into the Pacific Ocean. We've got polar bears in Alaska dying with skin lesions. You've got seals dying with skin lesions. You've got 1,000 dolphins washing up dead in Peru. My concern is that one of these reactors could explode. We could have a massive hydrogen explosion. And I know just one of the reactors has like 400 tons of nuclear fuel. If there is this massive hydrogen explosion and it emits hundreds of tons of radioactive material into the atmosphere, this is an apocalyptic scene at this point.
And no one's doing anything about it, Rick. And that's the problem here that I see, is that, the canary in the mine has died, and they don't seem to care. I called the Coast Guard, and they poo-pooed everything. We're going to have a massive cleanup, but don't worry about the nuclear. It's been taken care of, anything nuclear. Well, I don't agree with that at all. You've got refrigerators coming across, that are still shut, and we don't know what's inside of them. And I think to say that we don't have a problem ahead of time is just being very naive at best.
Well, the debris field of trash that's floating in the Pacific towards America and Canada is the size of the state of California.
Yeah.
Okay, it will take 60 years for it to circulate through the Pacific around the rim and drop the debris off on the coastlines. 60 years to finally get rid of all that stuff. What about shipping? For the next 60 years, people that are on boats have to wonder in the middle of the night, are they going to hit a house that's floating in the ocean?
Or a refrigerator.
Or a boat or ship or whatever is out there. I'm concerned, Cliff, about 2 weeks ago I was in our chapel praying, and I felt so strongly that when I left the chapel, I was to go back to my office and study the jet stream patterns. And I looked and I saw the northern jet stream swooping down over Japan, and I just,
It comes through the Sea of Japan, then works its way into the Gulf of Alaska, and then it turns and works its way down the coast and usually comes in Washington and Oregon and then moves on to the east and northeast. But occasionally, during the winter months, it digs south all the way to California, and that entire coastline could be filled with debris. But where we really think the debris, and I asked the Coast Guard this, they think the debris field will be somewhere between Brookings, Oregon, and the coast of British Columbia, that right along there'll be a lot of debris eventually.
But
they're not worried about the nuclear, they said, but they're worried about collisions with large objects with shipping. They think it could be a big problem for shipping.
If there is a massive release of radioactive material into the atmosphere in the coming months because of an explosion, where would the jet stream take the radiation?
Well, the radiation would be carried into that same jet stream, in my opinion, because this is northeastern Japan. It would be carried into that same jet stream, and in the Sea of Japan, it would work its way, as I said, across in the Gulf of Alaska, and then work its way down the coast and over us here in the eastern U.S. And then it would work its way across the country. Now, keep in mind, there's also more than one jet stream. When I hear, I kind of cringe when I hear about the jet stream.
I was going to ask you about
There's many branches of the jet stream. There's a continental polar jet stream, a maritime polar jet stream. That's the one that comes from the Sea of Japan. There's two branches of the subtropical jet stream that when we go into El Nino, they become pumped up. And they diminish when we have La Nina, the cooler cycle, and that's why it's been so dry from Texas to California. It's been super dry. In fact, in the Rio Grande Valley, there's places where the irrigation water has dried up and they can't plant anything. With a fellow near Brownsville, Texas, and he has a brother that lives in Del Rio, and he said they may not plant anything this year because of the lack of water. They've had no rain.
Cliff, if there was an apocalyptic explosion at Fukushima, where would you want to be?
Well, I think that if it were that great, there would be at least the same kind of problems we had with strontium-90 50 years ago, remember, in the milk?
Yes.
Along the West Coast, and that was attributed to the Chinese testing of their nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And we did have higher levels of strontium-90 in our milk. Well, this time around, it would be 10 times that low. And it would be dangerous.
Would it be primarily on the West Coast?
Well, it would hit the West Coast first.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what happened with the strontium-90, right? It wasn't.
Right.
It didn't hurt areas east of the Rockies that much. They found traces, but nothing more. I don't know. The problem is they won't tell us.
No.
They won't tell us about anything. I do know one thing. The fellow that I talked to with the Coast Guard said, you got to stop this crazy weather. Like I'm in production. I tell them I'm not in production, I'm only in sales. But they admit that this is some of the craziest weather they've ever seen. You know, that for the first time ever, they had to go out hunting for people that were in these yacht races because the boats overturned. And, they had a death for the first time in decades.
There is some stuff on the internet that I've not been able to verify. I talked to one of the men who wrote it. He claims that he personally visited this Russian scientist in Siberia, but he will not give me any other information to verify that claim. He just says, yes, I went to Siberia. I interviewed him. There is a Russian physicist who says that our solar system has entered an interstellar energy cloud that is exciting the atmospheres of the planets and the sun.
It's not just the Earth.
Right, the whole solar system.
Of the planets.
Yeah.
Mars in particular has been really affected.
Do you know anything about this? Is this for real?
Yeah, I've heard that because also they're using still using the scientific discoveries that Nikola Tesla discovered decades ago, and they're still using them. And also, the Russians, at one time, before the Soviet Union broke apart, they were figuring out how to move this cold air from Siberia, move that cold air towards Alaska and towards us, so that we would freeze all the way down into Florida and kill the vegetables and citrus and everything. They were able to push this big high-pressure ridge. They would give it a shove. And also, the Chinese have such technologies now that they were able, during the 2008 Beijing Olympics, they had 37,000 people involved in these generators with these sulfur dioxide crystals. They were able to put this out into these areas around Beijing so that it would rain around Beijing and not during the Olympics in Beijing. And they had 37,000 people involved in that.
Cliff, I've noticed in the past year, I know of 3 different officials in other nations that have made cryptic references to the use of sci-fi, Tesla-like weapons. Last year, Boris Zarevsky in Russia. He's kind of the he's a real nationalistic guy. He runs for president every election. He's got a large following. He's in the Duma, in the parliament. He was on a Russian TV network sometime late last year, and he definitely had been in the vodka that day. His necktie was loose, and I mean his face was red.
That's when they're dressed up, Rick.
Oh yeah, I mean he was definitely he was juiced, and he told. Now I mean this was all in Russian, but they had an English translation, so I'm assuming the translation was correct. But he startled the news anchor woman. He referred to Fukushima, the tsunami, and the earthquake, and basically what he said was, if Japan wants another dose of what we did, we'll give it to them. And then he said, we have weapons that can put entire continents to sleep in seconds.
They use the rumbling. It's called the rumbling effect. They put rods deep into the earth, and they cause rumblings which set off earthquakes. I wrote about this, and I got so much hate mail on it that it was unbelievable, so I quit writing about it.
You got hate mail about it?
Yeah, they wouldn't believe it. But they've been using this technology for a long time, creating small earthquakes. It's the same thing we're creating in this country with the fracking operations with natural gas. We're creating these small earthquakes.
Well, the Russian...
And maybe ties in with the sinkholes.
The Russian spy defector Stanislav Lunov, who was a GRU military spy, he personally told me in 99, I flew him to Dallas, Texas, and he was with me for a couple of days, and he told me that Russia had an earthquake generator. So I mean that was in the 90s. Now a couple of weeks ago, the Russian news media reported that Putin has signed off on the go-ahead to go full throttle on the development of new Tesla-like weapons, and they referred to weapons that would attack the nervous system of people, weapons that would transmit thoughts into the skulls of large numbers of people in another country. This stuff is so far out there, but this is real.
Well, I wrote this back for my column on DTN. I've been on there for 30 years, Data Line Transmission Network, more than 30 years. But in 1985, I wrote about Nikola Tesla's design for man-made earthquakes. And it's because they can vibrate. They can control these vibrations. And every student of military history knows that any time a large number of soldiers march over a bridge, the commander tells them to break the pace of the march so that the bridge doesn't collapse. And it's all because of vibrations. Well, they've had this technology over 25 years, and they've been working on it. And they were ready for some major experiments just before the Soviet Union collapsed. That gave us a little more time. But we do know that even in the Bible, I shouldn't say even in the Bible, I don't even like that term, but in the Bible, in the 6th chapter of Joshua, it talks about this. It talks about how the Lord giving these instructions to utilize the trumpets of ram's horns, I believe is what I wrote about, directed towards the walls of Jericho. And this is very similar to what the Russians are doing with these rumblings, as they call them.
Mm-hmm. The other two references that I've picked up were just recent. A few months ago, a commander in the Iranian military said that Iran had hidden energy weapons that they were waiting to use on the United States. And then last week, the North Koreans said that they were going to use weapons of peculiar means to exterminate the rats in the South. So it sounds like a lot of the madmen are like itching. We can't wait to use this new generation of weapons.
Well, and not only that, but the Russians offered to get rid of the periodic 7-year mice infestations in Australia. They said they could do it with these rumblings. This rumbling technology. By the way, that is described, I think the book's name is Prodigal Genius. It's by John O'Neill. I don't know how come I can remember this today, but my memory's doing great today. But anyhow, John J. O'Neill is the fellow that wrote this, and it's all about man-made earthquakes. And it's the biography of Tesla, Nikola Tesla. I'm going to write more about this in this my third edition of the series I'm working on for longrangeweather.com. The first one is Those Aren't Just Raindrops Dropping on Our Heads, and the second one for this week, I'm talking about the fact that let's see, I can't remember exactly what the title is right offhand there. I can remember everything in the past, but not the future, or not the present. But anyhow, I'm writing about, what exactly that they're doing over our heads here. Let me get you the exact title because it'll be listed on the website. The exact title of it is Be Aware. Geoengineers are playing God with our weather.
All right, that's the next article coming up.
Number 2. The first one was Those Aren't Just Raindrops Dropping on Our Heads. That's part 1. Part 2 is Be Aware, Geoengineers are playing God with our weather. And then the third one is all about weather warfare, because I got a lot of stuff that I'm working on. I've got a fellow that's testified before Congress that I'm going to be interviewing this afternoon. His name is Bob Fletcher. And he's going to talk about the treaties that were signed that we're breaking and all of this. So I'm going to get some more information on that because they were signed 7 years ago and no one's living up to them.
Well, listen, we will have you back when you find out more information. Our audience, if you want to read Cliff's articles, they are at longrangeweather.com. And for our listeners who are ranchers, farmers, commodity traders, if your business depends on knowing weather patterns, Cliff's company is the one that you want to talk to, Long Range Weather.
And we hit new highs today in beans, over $15 a bushel. And they keep telling us that we got plenty of food, but we don't. They've been lying there, too. Every year we run out. And we can't even help nations we want to help.
Cliff, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking so much time. Climatologist Cliff Harris, longrangeweather.com. Well, I've got 3 or 4 minutes remaining to the close of the program, and I want to mention that U.S. federal law enforcement agents in battle gear will start next week patrolling parts of downtown Chicago inside the Loop in preparation for next month's NATO summit. Washington will assume control of law enforcement activities inside what is called the Red Zone. The summit is May 21st and 22nd. The Federal Protective Service notified Chicago residents and business owners that agents in battle gear will patrol the streets. Residents of one condo complex were told they will be locked down for days during the summit. Nobody will be permitted to enter or leave the building. The leaders of Chicago's local NATO host committee were shocked to learn about the extraordinary security measures. Now, the image of federal agents on downtown streets in battle gear wearing weapons 3 weeks before the summit is certain to have a chilling effect on those who live and work in the district. Now, in the event of trouble, the plan calls for authorities to shut down access to the Red Zone. And some Chicago residents said the plans are intimidating and even sinister. Perhaps a secret plan to evacuate Chicago residents in the event of major trouble is what is causing those residents to see sinister plots in the upcoming NATO meeting. A Chicago TV station obtained emails between Red Cross officials in Milwaukee. It said the NATO summit, quote, may create unrest or another national security incident. The American Red Cross in southeastern Wisconsin has been asked to place a number of shelters on standby in the event of evacuation of Chicago, end of quote. According to a Milwaukee Red Cross chapter spokesperson, the evacuation plan is not theirs. That person said, quote, our direction has come from the city of Chicago and the Secret Service, she said. A Milwaukee Red Cross spokeswoman told a Chicago radio station that the Wisconsin chapter will be standing by with beds, food, and doctors for Chicago evacuees if things get out of control next month. Now, the NATO summit corresponds with the same time Russian special forces will be at Fort Carson, Colorado, participating in an unprecedented military exercise with the U.S. Special Forces. The exercise will be held May 24 through the 31st. The Russian troops will, however, arrive in Colorado 1 week earlier. The Russian airborne troops will train with American Special Service weapons. A Russian military official said the purpose of the joint training is to practice airborne tactics and anti-terror operations, such as dropping into a hostile area and conducting a terrorist camp raid. Fort Carson is known as home of America's best, and the Russian airborne special forces will be trained to understand and operate military hardware and weapons used by U.S. Special Forces in airborne missions, including parachuting, operation planning, reconnaissance, assault operations, and evacuation by helicopter. So, will the Russian Special Forces be used in Chicago? All of this is very strange. Very, very strange what's going on. To learn that the Wisconsin Red Cross is standing by for the evacuation of Chicago, and we have Russian airborne special forces at Fort Carson, Colorado, the same time. Very, very troubling. Maybe the Russians are training for martial law in America when the Mac Daddy steals the election this November. Is that why Homeland Security ordered 450 million rounds of hollow point ammo for U.S. agents? Or was it for the Russian agents? Listen, my friends, you can no longer assume that the people in control of Washington are acting in your best interests. Well, that's today's edition of True News. If I say any more, I may get myself in trouble. It's getting very, very weird and very dangerous in this country. We appreciate those who have the courage to stand with us and support True News. Monday's the last day of the month. We need your financial support. Go to TrueNews.com. God bless you.